أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله كما علمنا أن نحمد وصلى الله وسلم على خير خلقه والمصطفى من رسله محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومعيته أجمعين من السابقين ومن اللاحقين. Dear brothers, dear sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We will continue our discourse on Bani Umayyah. As we said previously, and we repeat, because you will not find this in history books and you will not find this in Islamic resources or Islamic sources. There's a parallel in scriptural history concerning Bani Israel that runs side by side with the history of Bani Umayyah after the Prophet, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him and his. This is not very well developed. It's not developed at all, to be honest and upfront with you, when it comes to our perception of the past and our understanding of the present. I know when we speak about Bani Umayyah to many Muslims that we instigate a feeling of tribalism in them. And this is, I wish we could speak about these issues without this tribal affinity with whoever is a Sunni or whoever is a Shi'i. The majority of us, and I say this via my experience, the majority of us Muslims, regardless of which tribe we belong to, whenever it comes to these issues, when we take a fresh look at our history, all of a sudden this tribal instinct takes over. I wish we could do away with that so we can look at these issues without being labeled and pigeonholed. Anyways, that's the way it is, and I know when I speak about Bani Umayyah and when I speak about Muawiyah, I catch a lot of flack from those who are tribalistic Sunnis. That's the only way I can put it without being unnerving, because I don't want to get on anyone's nerves. I try to avoid that as much as possible. I want to look at these issues through the lens of the Quran. We quoted some ayat in the past, and in the future we will quote other ayat. But when it comes to Muawiyah himself, we have this historical overload that has given this person the title of Khalifa. And we pray for the day when the Muslims can mature enough, because both Sunnis and Shi'is call Muawiyah Khalifa. We pray for the day when we can outgrow this mislabeling and call him a king. He's the first king in Islamic governance. Was he a dictator who eliminated shura for all practical purposes? Is he the one who ushered in al-mulk al-adud? These, the two words al-mulk al-adud, which can be roughly translated as autocratic ruling, these are words that were prophesied by Allah's final prophet, who predicted that the rule after him will be a successorship, al-khilafa. That's to be followed by al-mulk al-adud, autocratic governance, which is to be followed, per the Prophet's word, by al-mulk al-jabri, dictatorship governance. And then it will return, the cycle, the time will come around full cycle, and there will be a governance similar to the governance of Allah's Prophet, the successorship to him. Some Muslims, they believe, because of their uncritical reading of history, they believe that Muawiyah was a Sahabi. Other Muslims believe that Muawiyah was not a Sahabi. Some Muslims believe, once again, because of our uncritical thinking through our history, some Muslims believe that Muawiyah was defending the third Khalifa Uthman. Others who are more thoughtful of this history believe that Muawiyah actually instigated and was a participant in an indirect way that led to the assassination of Uthman. Even though they belonged to the same clan, Bani Umayyah, both Uthman and Muawiyah, but Muawiyah was working to take over the rulership of the Muslims after Uthman. Muawiyah, of course, comes from Quraysh, and Quraysh had a very high standing before the Prophet and before Islam. And so Muawiyah and his father and the larger clan of Bani Umayyah that had a privileged position in the tribal makeup of Quraysh, they lost that position when Islam became predominant, and they nursed an ambition, a type of grudge that waited for the appropriate moment so that they could recapture the glory of Quraysh, the pre-Islamic glory of Quraysh, and now become the leaders of the Muslims. Another area of confusion when Muawiyah is mentioned, because we have the Salafis who raise Muawiyah to a status that competes with the companions of the Prophet, if not in some cases supersedes them. Was he a Sahabi, like these Salafis convince themselves? Or was he a Taliq? The description that was given by the Prophet of Allah, alayhi salatu wassalam, that was given to those who were amnestied when Mecca was liberated. The Prophet said to them, اذهبوا فأنتم الطلقاء. He said to Muawiyah and Abu Sufyan and the rest of the head honchos and their followers in Mecca who were at war with him, psychological warfare, propaganda warfare, economic warfare, military warfare for around 2 decades. The Prophet said to them, "Now you are free. I amnesty you." And so Muawiyah and Abu Sufyan and some other chieftains in Quraysh and in Mecca were called at-Tulaqa. So the Tulaqa is plural, the singular is Taliq. So was Muawiyah a Sahabi on par with Abi Bakr and Abdul Rahman ibn Auf and Umar ibn al-Khattab and Uthman ibn Affan and Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas and Talha and Zubayr and Ammar and Bilal and Suhaib and the rest of these? Was Muawiyah to be included among them? Or, listen closely to the Prophet as he says to them, gives them their designation of being at-Tulaqa and al-Mu'allafa qulubuhum. Al-Mu'allafa qulubuhum is a Quranic designation, and it defines those who are to be won over to Islam, to be included in the fold of Iman by giving them some prestige in society. In other words, because of the mercy that is embedded in the Islamic character, especially in the character of the decision makers, they don't want to be rough and tough against the enemies of the past 2 decades. They just want to soothe them into Islam, to be forthcoming towards them, not damage their previous social status. And so you give them some type of privileges, or you give them, those who are lesser in fortune, you give them some money so that they don't become the underclass of an Islamic society. This group of people is called al-Mu'allafa qulubum. Of course, Abu Sufyan and Muawiyah and these big wigs who were at war with the Prophet for almost 20 years, they didn't need money, but they needed someone not to euphemistically slap them in the face. Needed, that's why when Mecca was liberated, the Prophet said, whoever goes to Al-Haram is secure, meaning goes to the Kaaba and its surrounding is secure. No one's going to pursue them. And then he says, وَمَنْ دَخَلَ دَارَ أَبِي سُفْيَانَ فَهُوَ آمِنٌ. And whoever enters the residence of Abi Sufyan may consider themselves secure. This was a gesture from Allah's Prophet to preempt the tumbling from positions of power. Abu Sufyan and his crowd lost their control over Mecca now. Now Mecca was to be governed by the Prophet of Allah and the followers of Allah's Prophet. But that was not to be done in a way that would fire up a reactionary attitude from these now newcomers to Islam, who now became Muslims because that's the only option that was left to them. Islam was the wave of the future, and the only thing they could do right now is say, yeah, we're Muslims just like everyone else. So some Muslims, especially in the misinformed Salafi quarters of the world, they say that Muawiyah was a dahiya. That's their word, quote unquote dahiya, which means roughly it means a political genius. That's how they refer to him. So a person in my position, I'm not trying to slap Salafis on the face, and I don't get involved in any of that. Just trying to present the issues as they are through the understanding of Allah and His Prophet. Of course, there are facts that you can't run away from, and how you square these facts in your mind is something you personally are going to have to work out. One of these facts is that Muawiyah was the son of Hind bint Utbah ibn Rubay'a ibn Rabi'a. Hind is known, it's a historical fact, that when Hamza became a shaheed at the battlefront, she went to his body, plucked out his liver, and began to chew on his liver. This was in the years of hostility and warfare against the Muslims, against the Prophet, against the Sahaba, against the committed and struggling Muslims around the Prophet. You can't run away from that fact. We know that later on, Hind, Muawiyah's mother, became a Muslimah, but that was when there was no other choice. She either had to become a Muslimah, or she could have maintained her position of irreconcilability with Allah's Prophet and with the Islamic order, and she knew enough to know that if she did that, she would be more or less an outcast among her own people, because everyone has become a Muslim. So the best thing to do in those types of circumstances is you say, I'm a Muslimah. She died in the 14th year of the Hijrah, so we can say that she spent the last 4 or 5 years of her life as a Muslimah, who was more or less subdued by the rising force of Islam. Another issue that complicates our evaluation of Muawiyah is that he was utilized during the time of the Khulafa. That utilization was not meant to enlist Muawiyah as a Sahabi, as much as it was meant to facilitate the relationship that Bani Umayyah had prior to Islam with the Byzantines. Of course, it worked later on in the opposite direction, but initially, that was as I read it, that was the intent and purpose. When Al-Khalifa Umar appointed Muawiyah as the ruler in Damascus, when his brother Yazid died, he did that hoping that the Muhajirin and Ansar influence would submerge the Qurayshi pre-Islamic status of power. We will try to explain later on how Muawiyah worked on this relationship with the Byzantines to undermine the Muhajirin and the Ansar, who were the foundation of the Islamic order. Muawiyah also leaves us no choice but to ask ourselves, who are the ones who are qualified to head an Islamic state? Are they the ones who configure first and foremost a taqwa of Allah, meaning they are only concerned with factoring in Allah's authority and power presence, that is taqwa? Or are they primarily concerned with worldly powers? They are obsessed with the armies of the world, the military technology of the world, those nations who have military prowess, and then Allah comes in secondary. Inshallah, we will see as we proceed that Muawiyah was of the latter and not of the former. He used religion for political purposes. And this will become more clear as we delve into this subject with more information and with more details. And this appeared in one of those instances when he was about to lose at Siffin, and he, for political purposes, in a Machiavellian style, he raised, along with his comrades in arms, he raised the Mus'haf, the copies of the pages of the Quran, on swords and on spears, saying to his opposing camp of Imam Ali and the committed Muslims with him that we want to adjudicate our affairs to Allah's book. This is our reference when we disagree. Of course, all of that was Machiavellian. He didn't believe in any of Allah's words and any of Allah's instructions when those instructions and those ayat conflict with his political and military ambitions. He was the type, Muawiyah was a type of ruler who bought over some quote-unquote Islamic scholars. He was the type who tried to influence public opinion, win public opinion over to his side. He was the one who used the bloodied shirt of the third Khalifa Uthman to instigate asabiyya, that is tribal and nationalistic and ethnic self-centeredness, to use against his opposing camp, meaning that of Imam Ali and those who are with him. He had no compunction about using one enemy against another enemy. You can say he was, if we take today's world and today's diplomats, Muawiyah would fit very comfortably in the world of Kissinger and in the world of Brzezinski and in the world of Netanyahu and the Zionist and imperialist diplomats and politicians. He'd fit comfortably in that camp, but the only thing you do with Muawiyah is you give him Islamic rituals, and some Muslims, they get fooled by appearances, and they think that Muawiyah was a class 1 ruler. There is some historian differences among historians most of what we have today, because history is always written by the victorious. Those who win the wars, they write the histories. So that's how the history was written about Muawiyah, that he was Katib Wahi. He was the person who was writing the ayat of the Quran. And then there are other historians who said, no, it wasn't the ayat of the Quran, that he was a scribe, but it wasn't the ayat of the Quran, it was the correspondence that the Prophet of Allah, alayhi wa alihi salatu wassalam, had sent to the kings and the rulers of that time, to the ruler in Persia, to the ruler in Byzantium, to the ruler in Muqawqis in Egypt. There was correspondence, and Muawiyah wrote those letters that were dictated to him by the Prophet. There were wars called Hurub al-Ridda, when Abu Bakr became the ruler, the consensual ruler of the Muslims. These wars were breakaway wars by certain tribes in Arabia that did not want to feel financially obligated to Bayt al-Mal. They were called Mani'i Zakat. We don't want to pay our Zakah to the treasury in Al-Madinah. They were praying, they were fasting, they were doing all the rituals. One thing they were not doing, they were not financially responsible. And so there were wars because of that, and they had the potential of developing into a meltdown of an Islamic authority and an Islamic state. During these wars, in order for Bani Umayyah to gain credibility, they did not join the sides of al-Murtaddin, the breakaway factions in Arabia. And they gave verbal support, at least verbal support, to the Khilafah. And so that sort of nudged them up one notch in public opinion. Muawiyah, because of his egotistic ambitions, may have been involved in a very awkward way in setting up Uthman to be assassinated. And it's not only Muawiyah, it could have been other members of Bani Umayyah who were around Muawiyah, who were around Uthman at that time, and they wanted to get rid of him because they saw him as a person who is not willing to shift the Khilafah into Mulukiyah. He's not willing to have the Islamic system of governance change from that of successorship to the Prophet with the standards and the principles and the values of Allah and His Prophet, so that it becomes a monarchy or a kingdom. And they wanted a monarchy and a kingdom. They wanted hereditary rule in Bani Umayyah. So they worked their way towards that end by having positions of influence during the reign of Uthman. There's a question mark here in Islamic history. When the rebels came, who were fed up with the mismanagement in the administration of Uthman, the rebels who came from different parts of the Islamic domain at that time, especially those who came from Egypt, well, they were convinced that Uthman is going to mend his ways, meaning Uthman's administration is no longer going to abuse power. So they were on their way back to Egypt. But there was a letter that went from Uthman's office to the ruler in Egypt. And now there's a question mark concerning who wrote that letter. In Uthman's inner circle, someone wrote that letter that re-instigated the rebels to come back to Al-Madinah, and that resulted in the assassination of Uthman. There's reason to believe that if Muawiyah himself did not write that letter, he was in on it. So there was a popular, some may call it an uprising against Uthman, and Muawiyah wanted to use that popular uprising and channel it against Al-Imam Ali. And we will see how this happened when Muawiyah claimed that he is the wali of Uthman. فَقَدْ جَعَلْنَا لِوَلِيِّهِ سُلْطَانًا فَلَا يُسْرِفْ فِي الْقَتْلِ. The ayah in the Quran. The guarantor of Uthman has, or the guarantor of whoever has been unjustifiably killed, his next of kin, his guarantor, is given the authority to get even. But Muawiyah was not out there to get even. Muawiyah was out there to grab power. And inshallah this will become clear as we expose Bani Umayyah and Bani Israel in this series. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. وصلى الله على محمد وآل محمد والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.